Now, when we talk about sustainable use of biodiversity, what is sustainable use of biodiversity? Sustainable use of biodiversity means the use of its components in such manner and at such rate that it does not lead to long-term decline of biodiversity, and thus thereby maintaining its potential to meet the needs and aspirations of the present and future generations. So that is what sustainable use. So this sustainable use is elaborated, and elements of sustainable use is elaborated in Article 10 of CBD, and it says that we have to integrate these consideration of conservation and sustainable use of bioresources into national decision making, and we have to also support communities who have been customarily conserving and traditionally using the biological resources in a sustainable manner, and various ways of including customary use, sustainable use and different policies. All these things are mandates of the state governments, the national governments, to incorporate it in its decision making. So the convention has also adopted a voluntary guidelines called Addis Ababa Principles and Guidelines, which has 14 principles, which also have which also mentions that you need to have supportive policies, laws, institutions in order to effectively link all the governance level for sustainable use, and has 14 principles, very relevant. This is also incorporated in our India's legal system. We have the National Biodiversity Action Plan talking about sustainable use of biodiversity. We have also included a lot of a lot of policies and incorporated the sustainable use into these policies. For instance, we have our Conservation Strategy and Policy Statement on Environmental and Development. We have the Environmental Policy of 2006, National Wildlife Action Plan. All these recognize the sustainable use of biodiversity. But also we have the important legislation that deals with conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity is the Biological Diversity Act, and under the Biological Diversity Act, the National Biodiversity Authority and the State Biodiversity Board, they have the right to restrict and prohibit activities that are relating to biodiversity related activities on the basis that these have impact on the environment, these are unsustainable, etc. So that is a provision that's already there in our legislation. Now let's go to the focus areas. One is Article 8J related to Article 10C, which means how to protect the knowledge and the practice of indigenous and local communities and the practice associated with conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. When you say that, we can find that there are not too many legislations available in India. So the Biodiversity Act has two components, that's like the section 36(5), which says that the state government has to develop measures so that there will be sui generis protection for registration of local people's knowledge of biodiversity. So, and also we have section 41C, which mandates the biodiversity management authorities for documentation of knowledge relating to biodiversity, also for conservation and sustainable use, and also these are somewhere linked with you can link all these provisions with the indigenous and local communities right under Article 8J and Article 10C. We also have under Plant Varieties Protection and Farmers' Rights Act, the farmers' varieties that can be registered and benefit sharing can be done. So these are the some areas relating to protection of indigenous and local communities, right? But not really, we don't have extensive areas for that. But also the Traditional Forest Rights Act can also be viewed as a tool to kind of integrate this particular right of indigenous and local communities. Now I move on to the Biodiversity Inclusive Environmental Impact Assessment. So under Biological Diversity Act, you have the central government again has a mandate under section 36(4)(1) to kind of adopt measures to undertake EIAs which are likely to have adverse effect in biodiversity, and to kind of avoid or minimize all this adverse effect, and with the participation of local public and the local communities for such assessment. We already know that we already have an environmental impact assessment regulation under the Environmental Protection Act, and in the regulation we have a special provision relating to sensitivity of biodiversity, wherein the project proponent has to mention all the biodiversity related components in those areas where he wants to build a project, and also kind of like say what are the mitigating measures that he is adopting for that. And these in the EIA, the authorities will consider and appraise this information while they are granting environmental clearance. In addition, we also have an additional level of protection when we deal with development projects in protected areas like national parks and sanctuaries, because in those areas it's not possible, and it is if you need a environmental development project, environment clearance in those areas, you need to submit it to the National Board for Wildlife, the Standing Committee of National Board for Wildlife. You need a clearance or recommendation from the wildlife. Then it also has to go to the Supreme Court. All these are by case laws, and there is such additional protection for biodiversity inclusive environmental impact assessment in India. Now let's deal with biosafety. As already mentioned, India has passed rules for biosafety, for regulating living modified organisms or genetically modified organisms or hazardous substance under the Environmental Protection Act. The Biodiversity Act also has a provision relating to it under section 3642, where it is a mandate of the central government to make provisions for governing the use and release of living modified organisms. So the rules of India, that is rules for manufacture, use, import, export, storage of hazardous microorganisms, genetically engineered organisms or cells, 1989, kind of establishes 6 authorities or institutional bodies for regulating all these activities relating to living modified or genetically modified organisms, in which the Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee is the most important body, and you cannot undertake any activity like import, export, transport, manufacture, a number of activities without the without the approval of Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. So whenever biotechnology companies want to buy a genetically modified organism, for example, if you want to develop a CRY-gene, that is a genetically modified gene, or import a CRY-gene, you need the permission of Genetic Engineering Appraisal Committee. If you want to develop a genetically modified cotton, you need approval of Genetic Appraisal Committee. The committee will appraise the information and look into all the provisions that are related to the risk that are associated with this, and then on that they will give approval, and sometimes will not give approval. So we already have those things in place. Also, this under the convention we have the Cartagena Protocol, which deals with biosafety. It also look into transboundary movement of living or modified organisms, transit and handling, and it also needs certain procedures, which is like you need the person who is sending the living modified organism need to appraise the country who is receiving it, and you need the permission of the states into which it is imported. So all these regulations are there again in Cartagena Protocol. We are also a signatory to Cartagena Protocol, so we also have the obligation under the Cartagena Protocol dealing for safe handling of living modified organisms. So these are the topics that we have covered today. We have discussed what is biodiversity, we have discussed the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, what are the international and the national framework, and what are the measures that the nation states have to kind of adopt under its obligation under the international framework, under the national framework. Also, we have discussed special focus areas like indigenous and local communities' right to protect, also customary use of biodiversity. Also, we've discussed the inclusive biodiversity inclusive environmental impact assessment, and we've discussed biosafety regulations. So I think it was a informative discussion. Thank you.